Hey everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the emitter node tutorial. Take a look up at the top right there for a link to the first video if you haven't seen that already. Definitely would encourage you to take a look at that one first before diving into this one. So just a very quick recap, what we were looking at before is setting up a very basic emitter chain, and that was to take this pEmitter node that's right here, and to do that we cannot connect that directly to the media out. We need an interface in between. So pEmitters, we can't view these. We need this render node here, this pRender node, to be able to view what's coming out of this emitter node. So we connect the three up like this, and then up here we see on our media out our region, which is currently a sphere. I'm just going to change this to remove the checkered background. So there's our sphere region. Now what we sort of touched on a little bit was the 2D and the 3D nature of Resolve. We were really focused just on the 2D aspect, but before we get into going much further with the emitter node, I just want to do a brief overview of sort of how the 3D interface works within Resolve. So let's take a look at that real quick. So as we looked at last time, when we click on our emitter node, we come up here to region, and we see our region is defined as a sphere. So we know a sphere is a 3D object, but we're looking at this from a 2D perspective of that. And this viewer right now is a 2D viewer. I can't scroll around, I can't look behind this thing. So the first thing we got to figure out is how do we unlock the 3D nature of Resolve. So Resolve actually has a pretty seamless integration between the 2D and 3D worlds. And because of that good integration, it can sometimes be a little bit confusing. Am I sort of in the 2D realm or the 3D realm? All of these nodes can sort of fit into one of those two camps, or some can sort of straddle both, which I'll clarify a bit in a minute. But we can switch between the 3D realm and the 2D realm as we go throughout our node structure. So here's what I mean, for example. So right now, I'm going to just disconnect this media out right now. I'm going to look at this render node. I'm going to drag this render node up to the viewer. And right up here, I see as an output mode, I see a 2D output mode. So right now, this render node is in this 2D mode. That's why I can connect it up to this media out. The media out expects a 2D input. The reason it turns red right there is because it's not being displayed anywhere. So as soon as I display that to a viewer, it turns back to white. So what do I want to do if I want to enter the world of 3D? I have to do that through this render node. So the emitter, as we looked at before, its regions are both 2D and 3D. So a cube would be a 3D. We have bitmaps. We have rectangles in the 2D realm, for example. So it's really up to this render node to decide how it wants to pass things on to the rest of the node chain. So in this example, we have it set up to 2D, but we can certainly change that to 3D. So I'm going to drag my render node back up here, and I'm going to take this output mode and I'm going to change it to 3D. So now we've changed into our 3D viewer. So I can't change this 3D viewer on my own. I can't just say, okay, hey 3D viewer, change yourself into a 2D view. This viewer is context sensitive depending on what node is put in there. So if you put a 3D node in here, you'll get this representation. A 2D node, it'll be back to what we're used to. Now you'll notice I cannot now connect this render node up to this media out. It just doesn't let me, because this is expecting a 2D output and I'm now in the world of 3D. So to make this chain complete, I need to come up to this section in our toolbar here. So what this is a subset of all the 3D nodes that we have. And at the very end, there's this render 3D node. So I'm going to pull that down. And the job of this render 3D node is to take a 3D input and convert it to a 2D output, which the media out expects to see. So now when I drag this media output up here, there we go. I see a 2D representation, but we've kind of gone through this 3D realm over here. I'm going to get back to this in a minute. And again, one of the purposes of the render node here, this render node here, is to allow us to see the emitter. So if I were to take this emitter and I were to drag it up here and I let it drop, take a look what happened. We switched to this view here, a 3D view. That's not actually the emitter, and we can tell because the name up top is pRender1. Resolve was smart enough to say, you know what, I can't display this, so I'm going to go down the chain and I'm going to use this render node here to put in the viewer. So in terms of navigating around this viewer, I can hold the middle mouse button down and I can move back and forth. I can use my mouse wheel and I can kind of scroll up and down this way. I can hold control with my mouse wheel and that'll zoom in and out. And I can hold alt down, and then when I'm holding my middle mouse button, I can move my mouse around and rotate around things here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, let's say I have my whatever object that I want to rotate around up here. So I hold down alt, I hold down my middle mouse button, and I'm kind of rotating out here, but if you notice, it kind of goes off screen here, right? So one of the things you can do is hit F, that's the shortcut for fit. brings it into the middle of the screen, and now when I rotate, I'm going to rotate around whatever object I have selected. I can still zoom out if I like, if I'm in a bit too close, and I can still rotate, but at least it keeps things sort of centered where I want to see them. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to bring up our dual viewer. I'm going to put this render node here in our first viewer, and I'm going to put our media out over here. Now you'll notice our media out, we're kind of really zoomed out here. So I could kind of do things in sort of the 2D fashion and sort of make the size bigger and all that type of stuff, and it'll expand upon the screen. But what we really want to do is introduce cameras. A camera is just going to essentially set our view however we choose, and we can do whatever we want with that camera. We can do animations, we can do a whole bunch of stuff. So let's take that camera, that's an icon over here, that's this 3D camera, and we're going to bring it over here around our render node. So if I highlight over this green arrow here, that's the camera input. So I'm just going to give us a bit more space here. I'm going to take this camera and I'm going to bring it in to here. So we're going to take our camera first and we're just going to move it back a little bit. So now when you see where our camera is kind of looking, it's sort of looking right all around this sphere, and we see that sort of show up over here. A couple handy commands. Let's say I have my camera set up over here and I like this view a little bit better. I want the camera to look right here. I want my eyes to be the camera. I can right click over here on this perspective and I can say copy point of view to camera 3D. And now my camera has been snapped to this section here. And you'll notice my media out reflects that as well. So I can switch to perspective mode, and now I can kind of zoom and sort of do whatever. I can also right click on this and I can get all these orthographic perspectives over here, front, top, left, right. So let's click on top, for example. There we go. We can see top, we can whatever, we can move our camera around, all that type of stuff. So that's really going to give us enough to move ahead with it with the rest of the tutorial. So let's get rolling. Okay, so for those that are following along, I replaced my emitter with a fresh emitter node just to have all the default values. I've also brought in this arrow node. This is a media in. This is the bitmap that I was using for the first tutorial. We're going to be using this a little bit later. For now, it's not hooked up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this sphere region. We see it as a sphere in 3D over here. And I'm just going to reduce the size a little bit just to kind of mimic a bit of a point source. And the reason I'm going to do that is it's just going to make things a little bit clearer where things are kind of coming from. They're not coming from a field. They're just coming from a very specific region. So there we go. That's probably good enough for now. So we go and we play this. Okay, nothing's really happening. There's no motion. So let's go back over to the controls over here, and I want to talk today about the velocity, rotation, and spin. So let's start off with velocity. So velocity right now, as far as units are concerned, in the realm of 3D, kind of think of velocity as a bit of a unitless quantity. In 2D realm, at least according to the manual, if you're looking at things in 2D, if you set this value to 10, that will mean a particle will traverse the entire width of the screen in one frame. So if you were to set a velocity of 1, it would take you 10 frames to go across the screen. But we're bringing in cameras in the world of 3D, and we can zoom in and out, and that all kind of falls apart. So just really think of this as whatever you need, whatever value you need, put it in there. So we're going to increase things a little bit. We're just going to get a little stream of particles going here. So that's good. Just bring it up. We have a velocity variance here. We can use this to change the relative velocities of each of these particles. One cool thing we can do with it if we wanted to is if I set our velocity back to 0 and we were to increase this velocity variance, you're going to have some velocity values that are positive, some that are negative. So here's our point source in the middle. We're actually shooting out both different directions. So if you wanted something like that, that's one quick and easy way to do it. In any case, we're going to bring this variance down to 0, and we're just going to impart a small velocity on things. That's looking pretty good there. We're going to skip over these inherits because this is talking about how the particle system relates to other nodes. So we're just going to forget about that for now, since we're focusing on just the emitter node for this tutorial. Now we're going to talk about angle here. We have angle and we have angle in Z. So what you notice we don't have is sort of an X, Y, Z type thing. So what angle refers to is always it's going to be referring to your XY plane. So if we look at our little gizmo here, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here, and we look at our perspective gizmo down here, we have the red is X, so X in our case, in our media out is this, Y is up and down, and Z is this blue one, and that's coming in and out of the screen essentially. Angle here is always referring to an angle with respect to the XY plane. So right now an angle of 0 would be defined as this, and then a positive angle would come around sort of this way here. So if we start to increase this in the positive direction, we're going to see this kind of loop around like that. So we can change the angle by dragging it to whatever we want. And this unit here is in degrees. So if we go to 45, for example, there we go. We're shooting off on a 45-degree angle relative to this x-axis, which is defined down here. So we'll set that back to 0 for now. So now we have this angle Z, and that's going to sort of rotate things and point things towards the camera. So let's take a look at how that works here. So we're kind of rotating around the y-axis in the XZ plane. So one thing to note here, so we're starting from the source back here and we're coming towards the camera. And it's a bit hard to tell here, but there's some perspective going on. The particles over here closer to the camera should appear larger than the ones in the back. We're just using these point particles now, so they don't really have any volume to them. So what we're going to do just to demonstrate that is I'm going to stop my animation right here because I'm going to be changing the particles to bitmap, and with this number of particles it's going to just bring my computer to a bit of a halt. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to take the number and I'm just going to bring things down just to 1 for now. And then we'll go back over to our style, and I'm going to change style to bitmap. And we're going to take our arrow here and we're going to connect that up. And now we see all these arrows kind of coming at the screen. These are pretty big right now, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this camera back a little bit. And the farther back we drag it, the more perspective shift that we're going to notice. So this looks okay there. I'm going to grab my emitter node again. I'm just going to change I'm going to keep the lifespan. I'm actually going to take this number, I'm going to bring it down to something less than 1. So I'm going to say 0.25. So what that means is every 4th frame, a new particle is going to be generated. I'm going to increase the velocity a little bit. And I'm going to angle things a little bit closer to the camera as well. There, so now we see the perspective. So small arrows back here are getting larger as they come forward. Okay, so quick recap on velocity. So the way the angles work here, this angle here is going to refer to the XY plane, which is the plane of your monitor, and the angle is going to be relative to the x-axis, which is a horizontal line. And you can think of angle Z as if there was a big vertical pole sort of down the middle of your 3D space, and you're sort of rotating around that. Okay, so let's start to talk about this rotation here. So I'm going to get rid of this angle. So that's going to flatten things back into our XY plane. And what I want to do is, when I start to put some motion on these here, we want to have the arrow pointing in the direction that we're going. And to do that, we can use this rotation here. So rotation is going to sort of set up our initial state, if you will, of how these particles are oriented in space. And it's perfect for something like this, where we have motion going this way and we would want our particle to actually point in a different direction. So if we weren't using a bitmap as our style, and we were just using something that's symmetrical all around, like a sphere, then this rotation has there's no purpose here. But what we can do is we can rotate in the z-axis to have these things point towards the right, because the z-axis is remember something going in and out of the screen, so we can rotate each of these particles around that point. So if I set our z variance up to 90, or not our variance, sorry, if I set our z value up to 90, I'm going to type it in directly. There we go. We're all pointing in this direction here. So that's how rotation works. Rotation sort of sets things up initially, but it doesn't do anything per frame. It could if we wanted to keyframe it, but for now we're not going to. If we want these things to sort of rotate throughout time, we can come down and use our spin. So here we will go in the Z also. So I'm going to rotate these things around in the same axes, but I'm going to put this up to, let's say, 3 degrees. And again, all these values are in degrees, 3 degrees per frame, and you end up getting something that looks like this. So you can use rotation to set up your initial orientation of your bitmap, for example, and then spin to actually do something on a per frame basis. So let's go right back to our 0th frame, and there's going to be nothing, nothing's created because we have this number set to 0.25, so that means every 4th frame something's going to get created. So we're at 0, 1, 2, 3. So this is our 4th frame here, and you'll notice here that there's a little bit of angle. I'm gonna change that to 10 just so it's a little bit more drastic. So when this particle is born, this value here of 10 is already put on the first frame that this thing is born. So it doesn't start off at 0 and then next time it has 10 degrees. It starts off at 10. So just something to keep in mind. And when I go 4 frames further, 1, 2, 3, 4, our second particle is born and it is pointing at 10 degrees. And then this thing has been going on for 4 extra frames, so that's a total of 50 degrees. So all the particles are going to start with this value here, and then you can add a variance on top of that as well. And I'm only talking about Z right now, but this all applies into X and Y as well. For now, I'm just going to reset this back here. One thing you can do also is you can Say I wanted to shoot these particles out like this, but I wanted to spread a cone of 30 degrees or something like that. So to do that, I would use our angle variance, because remember, this is shooting out at 0 degrees with respect to this x-axis. So if we were to put here in our angle variance 30, that's going to basically create a 30-degree cone where these particles are shooting out from. Now the one thing that we do see here is that the arrows are not pointing in the direction that the particles are traveling. Well, we can do that by this rotation mode here. So we're set up to absolute rotation here. So that's saying that anything that's set in here is relative to our coordinate system that's sort of defined over here. That's the x, y, and z. But we want to switch to a different coordinate system, and that different coordinate system is going to be dependent on each of these particles and the motion of those particles. So if we come to rotation relative to motion, we click on that. There we go. Now we see these particles all pointing in the direction that they're traveling. So I've reset things just to come back to our little beam of arrows here. Let's say I impart some spin in the y-axis. So these things are kind of twisting along the y-axis. I can also click this always face camera, and that's a sort of an override of sorts. So we're always looking directly at the face of the bitmap. Alright, so I've reset up the animation to kind of slow things down a little bit, just to have a few particles on the screen at the time. So I have a 0.05, which is every 20 frames or so, we're going to have a new particle that's created, and I have them a lifespan set here to 80, so they're going to die out kind of right towards the end. So if you notice, these are all kind of popping in to life very abruptly, and they're kind of dying out just as fast. We can smooth that out a little bit. We can fade things in and out. And we can do that by going over to our style, and we can come down to these fade controls here. Now these fade controls are, the in and the out are set up in terms of percentages. So if we have a lifespan of 80 frames and we put a 0.1 in and a 0.9 out, that means for the first 10% of its life, it's going to be fading in, and for the final 10% of its life, it's going to be fading out. And we can see that happen right there. Alright, so I brought in a new emitter node again, and it's just a sphere that I've set up this time using blobs. Here's my settings right here. So here's my main settings. I'll just go over to style here, so I have it set up as a blob, and here's my region settings. So I wanted to bring this up to show just under style, under the size controls. There's a couple options here that I skipped over last time. Size to velocity. So this one here, depending on the velocity of each particle, we can sort of increase the size. So the faster the particle is going, the larger it's gonna get. So if you take a look as this animation runs, we'll pick this little particle back here. It's hardly moving, and then we'll look at some of the other ones here. So I'm just gonna stop on this frame right about let's say here. So we have these ones here that have high velocity, and some of these back here that are pretty low velocity. So if we change the size of our velocity, you're gonna see the ones that are moving faster are going to get larger. So the size is relative to how fast they're moving. There's also this control down here that's scale z size. So the way this is supposed to work, and I can't get it to work, and I may very well be doing something wrong. Please correct me below in the comments if I am. But the way that I believe this is supposed to work is the closer things are in the z-axis to the camera, this is a scaling factor. So the closer they are, the larger they would get. You can sort of exaggerate that perspective. Doesn't really seem to do anything though. So for the last few things that I want to go over, we're going to go back to the world of 2D, and we're going to talk about these merge controls. There's some blur options as well, and there's some stuff that I want to go over in the color controls as well. So let me just set up a quick 2D setup, and we'll get back in 1 minute. In the 2D realm right now, so I've taken the camera out of the picture, I've taken the 3D renderer out, and I'm back just to a very simple chain. So our emitter here into just a regular render node, and then to our media out. And this is a fresh emitter set up on a sphere here. So we have a fresh emitter here. I'm going to go into the region, and I'm just going to increase the size of this just to bring it up a little bit, the size of the screen. I'm going to come back here to the number of particles. Then I'm going to come into style, and I'm just going to change this to n-gon here, and I'll pick a solid n-gon here, and I'm going to increase the size of these. So we'll go with 5. So that's perfect. And let's come into the color, and we're just going to pick this blue here, and we're going to come down to color variance. So I've chosen blue, so I'm going to put some of this blue color variance on. So this here is going to take that blue value, and it's going to skew it by these amounts here. So this might not be the same format that you're used to. For example, a blue value that will go from 0 to 255. So we can change that if we want, and you can come up here into Fusion, you can go to Fusion Settings, and you can come down here to General, and then you can say show color as, and there's a value from 0 to 1, which is what it is by default, and that's how I have it set now. So each of these sliders goes from 0 to 1. You can change it from 0 to 255, or you can go up to the 65,000 here. Notice when you change this, it's not going to take effect immediately. In fact, it's not going to take effect in this particular fusion composition. I would have to change this, start a new fusion composition, and that new fusion composition would have color values set up like this. In any case, we're going to leave it at 0 to 1. That's fine for our purposes. So we have a red, green, we have a red in our green set, and we have a blue value over here, and we have some variant set up in our blue. So it gives us this little pattern that we see here. So if we scroll down here to merge controls and blur controls, let's focus on these right now. So merge controls, there's a whole tutorial's worth of stuff talking about different merges and how different layers sort of merge and interact with each other. But what we can think of this as is instead of this subtractive additive, we could almost rename this edge control. So let me just zoom in here, for example, and let's take a look at the edges between where a couple things overlap. So when I'm in additive mode, it will start to look like this here. And when I bring this down to subtractive mode, we get this sort of blackened edge here. So if I zoom out a little bit, now you can see this delineation between these different particles. So now we can talk about the burn-in over here, and what that's going to do is that's going to brighten up any overlapping spaces between different particles. So let's just take a look at that in action. So we bring it up just a little bit, and we start to see here that anything that's overlapping, we start to see brighten up. So we'll turn that one off for now. So now we come down to these blur controls here. So these blur controls, and again, this is only working in the world of 2D, which is what we're in now. There still is a 3D sense to these particle systems. Things are in front of one another, so there is a 3D nature to things. But as far as what this 2D symbol here means, that means that what that essentially means is that our render node is in 2D mode. So here's our render, we're in 2D mode here. Okay, so back to the emitter, I'm going to close this nodes down. We're going to come back to styles. We're going to come down to blur controls. So first we have just our general blur, and this is going to sort of blur everything. We have, I'm going to turn this off, then we have a blur variance, which is only going to blur sort of random particles. We have this blur over life here. Now what this is going to do, on the x-axis, this is the lifespan of the particle, and on the y-axis, this is from 0 down here up to 100%. So maybe a common mistake would be to think that this is sort of defaulting to 0. So if I were to add a node in here and sort of bring this up, it doesn't do anything immediately because it's going to be looking at our blur value. So we can crank up this blur value. And I crank up that blur value and I look at this and I say, hold on a second, this isn't really doing anything. As I play over the life of these particles, they look like they're all blurred. Well, the reason they look like that is because they're starting from 50% blurred up to near 100%. So if I want to really see the effect of this, I'll take this node and really drag it down. There we go. Now we see the new particles over here, here, and here, for example, they start off with no blurring. So just something to keep in mind when you're using this. You can also right click on this and go reset if you like. That'll bring things back to normal. So I'm going to take this blur off right now, and I'm going to go take a look at this depth of field blur. So depth of field, that's looking in the Z direction, so coming in and out of the monitor. So this depth of field blur determines how much blur is going to happen in a focus plane that's defined by this down here. This is defining our focus plane, and that plane is anywhere from near to far. So let's set up our focus plane. We're going to make our focus plane near to the camera. So things that are closer to us are going to stay in focus, and things that are far back are going to blur out. This bar doesn't do anything until you start to add some of this depth of field in here. So we're just going to add just a little bit in. There we go. And now we can see that stars that are in the foreground are still mostly in focus, whereas the stars in the background are out of focus. And I can take this, and I'm going to take this slider, and I'm just going to slide it right down to the other end. So what we should see is we should see this star, for example, go back out of focus, because we're pushing our plane of focus back into the screen, and something like this will come into sharper focus. So let's take a look. There we go. So we're in more in focus here, and we're blurred out here. Now these controls down here, the glow and the blur blend, I'm not really 100% sure how these work. I fiddled around with them a bit, and I'm still kind of confused by them. But what it seems to relate to is this glow seems to be related to your depth of field. So if I were to take this depth of field and kind of move things around, I have this glow sort of show up on certain certain particles, if I go down to the other end, those particles change, and I have this blur blend that's off, well then I never get any effect here. So again, not really sure too much about these. I don't want to try to explain something that I don't fully understand. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about are these color controls over here. So I've just set up another sphere region here, and again we're back in the world of 2D. I've just increased the size of the region here, and I've just put some n-gons in here that we can play around with. So of course you can just change the color, so that's not too exciting on its own, but let's just set up some values of 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, so that's sort of pure gray. And then we're going to come down to this color variance. So this is where things get a little bit more interesting here. So, and again, this color variance, this starts off at 0 and 0 for low and high, and that's applicable to each of the channels. So the red, green, blue, and alpha. So whatever range we set here is going to be added on top of this value here. So if we set, for example, the red between minus 0.1 and 0.1, that means our red value is going to change anywhere between 0.4 and 0.6. So if we take a look at one of these, and if we look at the status bar down on the bottom left, we see our red value, in this case is 0.559, and 0.5 for green and blue. So for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to put minus 0.2 and 0.2 for all these channels. So what I also want to do, and again, this is just to demonstrate, I'm going to line all these up on a particular value. So I'm going to put 0.3, 0.3, 0.3, just so they're all the same. And the reason I want to do that is I want to show what this lock color variance control does here. So if you look down here at the status bar, anytime I hover over one of these, you notice they're all gray, and that's because their RGB values are all the exact same. And they're the same because we have this lock color variance check. So if I uncheck that one, we'll start to see some color appear, and I come pick any one of those and the RGB values are all different. So if I go turn this back on, and let's pick this one down here, for example. So this is 0.45, 0.45, and 0.45. Now that only works that those are all lined up because the way I've set up all these variances is those are valid values for each of the channels. So for example, if I look at the blue value of 0.45, well, I'm going to move the color variance out of that range, and then that's going to be forced to change to some other value. We're saying for the blue channel, it's a value of 3 plus or minus 2, so anywhere from 0.1 to 0.5. So I'm going to take this blue, and I'm going to crank it up to here. So now, if I come back to this one here, red and green are at 0.45, but blue is changed to 0.942 because 0.45 doesn't fit within the variance range. So finally we can come down here and we can look at color life over controls. So what happens right now is this is a little time slider from the start to the end of the life of each of the particles, and it's set up as white right now, meaning it's not going to affect these colors that we have here. But if we wanted to, what we can do is we can pick a node. We can click anywhere on here and that'll create a new node. So I'm going to create a new node. I'm going to bring it to the end here. I'm going to change that to a value of red. So what that means is over the life of the particle, it's going to start off with this color here, whatever it's defined as here, and it's going to merge itself into whatever we set up here as our color gradient. So at the end of the life of each of these particles should all be red. So I've just let this run through so it's in cache. So you can see as the slider goes by here, we start off blue and then we kind of tend towards red towards the end of the life of the particles. So that's what color over life controls does. Okay, so that wraps up the emitter tutorial. So there's a couple other things that we didn't go over, but they kind of are worthy of tutorials on their own, and that's talking about sets and that type of stuff. So we'll get into that in further tutorials, but I think what we've done here is we've really established a good base that we can sort of build upon going forward. So I hope you guys find that valuable. So what we're going to start doing next is we're going to look at different nodes that are available for the particle system. And then we're going to start to go to the library of particle effects that ship with Resolve, and we're going to start to pick those apart a little bit, and that's going to push us towards eventually building some of our own particle systems. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll talk to y'all soon.